You're too paranoid for cybersecurity. My name is Logan Barrett. I'm 31 years old and I've been writing security code for government contractors in Arlington, Virginia for 6 years. When your boss tells you that you're too careful about protecting classified systems, something's already broken. I worked for Aegis Secure Tech, a private firm with clearance to maintain monitoring infrastructure for federal agencies. Not the flashy kind of cybersecurity you see in movies, just quiet, methodical work. Scanning firmware updates, patching vulnerabilities, making sure the digital locks on sensitive data actually locked. My desk sat in a sterile office building 3 blocks from the Pentagon, and most days I never saw sunlight until I walked to my car at 6 p.m. Greg Lathrop had been my supervisor for 2 years. Mid-40s, always wore expensive ties, talked about strategic partnerships and client retention. He approved every line of code that went into government systems, and he never questioned my work. Until last Tuesday. I was reviewing a routine firmware update for a Department of Homeland Security monitoring system when I spotted something that made my chest tighten. A small subroutine buried deep in the authentication layer, an outbound channel that activated under very specific conditions. It bypassed security protocols and rerouted data packets to an encrypted offshore node. I ran the trace 3 times, same result every time. The approval signature on that code belonged to Greg. I printed the evidence and walked to his office. He was on a conference call about quarterly projections, gesturing at spreadsheets on his monitor. When he saw me standing in his doorway with the printouts, he ended the call. "What's got you wound up, Logan?" I set the papers on his desk. "This firmware update has a backdoor." He glanced at the code, then leaned back in his chair. "Looks standard to me. It's creating an unauthorized data channel. Sensitive information is being copied to an external server." Greg laughed. Actually laughed. "You're reading too much into it. Sometimes clients need flexible access to their own systems. This isn't flexible access, this is a security breach." His smile faded. "Logan, you've been doing this work long enough to understand how the industry operates. Strategic access keeps clients dependent on our services. Don't act like you're above the business model." I stared at him. 6 years of late nights, security clearance reviews, and meticulous attention to detail, and he was telling me that deliberate vulnerabilities were just good business. "I'm not comfortable with this," I said. "Then maybe you're in the wrong field." I walked back to my desk and sat down. My hands were steady, but something fundamental had shifted. I'd spent my entire career believing that protecting government systems meant protecting the country. Now I was learning that my own supervisor was actively undermining that protection. I opened my workstation and began quietly copying files to an encrypted external drive. I'd been hired at Aegis Secure Tech straight out of graduate school at Virginia Tech. My thesis had focused on penetration testing for critical infrastructure, and Greg had recruited me personally. "We need someone who thinks like an attacker," he'd said during my interview. "Someone who can spot vulnerabilities before the bad guys do." For the first 4 years, I believed that's exactly what I was doing. I worked on firewall configurations for Department of Energy facilities, authentication systems for military contractors, and intrusion detection protocols for federal databases. The work was challenging and felt important. I was protecting systems that protected people. My security clearance required periodic reviews, background checks, and polygraph examinations. I'd passed everyone without issue because I had nothing to hide. My colleagues respected my attention to detail, and my code had never been compromised. Greg often praised my thoroughness in team meetings, but over the past year I'd started noticing small inconsistencies, code reviews that bypassed standard protocols, patches that seemed to introduce new vulnerabilities rather than fix existing ones. When I raised concerns, Greg would dismiss them as overthinking or explain them as necessary accommodations for client requirements. 3 months ago, I'd found similar backdoor code in a Treasury Department monitoring system. When I brought it to Greg's attention, he'd told me that the client had specifically requested that functionality for internal auditing purposes. I'd documented my concerns in an email, but he'd assured me that everything had been properly authorized. Last month, I discovered that our security certificates for several military contractor systems had been duplicated and stored on an unsecured server. Greg had explained it as a backup protocol required by the contract terms. But when I'd asked to see the contract language, he'd told me that those documents were above my clearance level. Each time his explanations had seemed plausible enough to quiet my concerns. I trusted him. He'd been my mentor, the person who'd taught me how to navigate the complex world of government contracting. When you work in cybersecurity, paranoia is part of the job description. You learn to question everything, but you also learn to trust your chain of command. Now, sitting at my desk with evidence of deliberate sabotage, I realized that my trust had been weaponized against me. Greg hadn't just been approving vulnerable code. He'd been systematically installing backdoors into critical government systems. And he'd been using my reputation for thoroughness to provide cover for his activities. I thought about my father, who'd served 20 years in the Air Force before retiring to a small farm in rural Virginia. He'd taught me that integrity wasn't negotiable, even when it was inconvenient, especially when it was inconvenient. I finished copying the files and locked my workstation. Greg's office light was still on, and I could hear him on another conference call. I had a decision to make, and I already knew what my father would have told me to do. The right thing was rarely the easy thing. I spent that night at my apartment going through every file I'd copied: firmware updates, patch documentation, approval chains, and traffic logs. The pattern was undeniable. Over the past 18 months, Greg had systematically installed backdoors into systems belonging to the Department of Homeland Security, the Treasury Department, and 3 major defense contractors. The backdoors were sophisticated. They activated only under specific conditions, rerouted data to encrypted offshore nodes, and left minimal traces in system logs. Someone with Greg's level of access and technical knowledge could have been extracting classified information for months without detection. I felt physically sick, not just because of the betrayal, but because of what it meant. Every system I'd helped secure had been deliberately compromised. Every late night I'd spent writing airtight code had been undermined by my own supervisor. I'd been working to protect national security, while unknowingly providing cover for someone who was actively selling it. At 2 a.m. I made coffee and opened my laptop. I drafted an email to Dr. Patricia Williams, a senior cybersecurity analyst at the Department of Homeland Security, whom I'd worked with on several infrastructure assessments. The email contained encrypted attachments with complete documentation of the backdoors, timestamps showing when they'd been installed, and approval signatures linking them directly to Greg. I used a whistleblower submission protocol that Dr. Williams had taught me during a training session, a secure communication channel with authentication layers that only verified DHS personnel could access. The protocol generated a receipt confirmation that proved the files had been delivered to the correct recipient, without being intercepted or modified. Before I sent the email, I sat in my kitchen and thought about the consequences. Reporting Greg would end my career at Aegis SecureTech. It would trigger a federal investigation that would scrutinize every project I'd ever worked on. It would destroy relationships with colleagues who might see me as a traitor rather than a whistleblower. But the alternative was worse. If I stayed silent, those backdoors would remain active. Classified information would continue flowing to foreign intelligence services. National security would be compromised by someone I'd trusted to protect it. I thought about my father again, about the oath he'd taken when he joined the Air Force, about the values he'd tried to instill in me. Integrity wasn't something you practiced when it was convenient. It was something you practiced when everything else told you to compromise. I clicked send at 2:47 a.m. The email disappeared into the encrypted channel, carrying with it evidence that would either vindicate my concerns or destroy my career. I closed my laptop and went to bed, knowing that I'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. When I woke up the next morning, I had 3 missed calls from Greg and a text message telling me to come to the office immediately. I showered, dressed, and drove to work, knowing it would probably be my last day at Aegis SecureTech. Greg was waiting for me when I arrived at the office. His usually perfect tie was crooked, and there were coffee stains on his shirt. He intercepted me before I could reach my desk. My office now. I followed him past the cubicles where my colleagues were settling into their morning routines. None of them looked up. Inside his office, Greg closed the door and pulled the blinds. "What the hell did you do last night?" I kept my expression neutral. "I went home and reviewed some code documentation." "Don't play games with me, Logan. I got a call at 6 a.m. from Dr. Williams at DHS. She's asking questions about firmware updates and approval protocols. Questions that suggest someone has been feeding her very specific information. So Dr. Williams had received my email, and she'd acted on it faster than I'd expected. Maybe she's conducting a routine security audit," I said. Greg stepped closer. "Cut the act. I know you copied files before you left yesterday. I checked the access logs. He'd been monitoring my workstation activity. That confirmed what I'd suspected about the level of surveillance at Aegis Secure Tech. It also meant that other people in the company might be involved in whatever Greg was running. If you're concerned about security protocols, we should probably discuss this with HR," I said. "HR isn't going to help you here." Greg sat behind his desk and opened his laptop. "I've been reviewing your performance over the past year. Missed deadlines, careless errors, failure to follow approval procedures. It's all documented. I'd never missed a deadline in 6 years. My error rate was the lowest on the team, and I'd always followed approval procedures exactly as written." "That's not accurate," I said. "It's accurate enough." He turned his laptop screen toward me. It showed a performance evaluation form with my name at the top and a series of negative assessments that I'd never seen before. "Your security clearance review is coming up next month. These performance issues will definitely be included in the report." The threat was clear. If I didn't back down, he'd sabotage my security clearance and end my career in government contracting. Without clearance, I'd be unemployable in my field. "I understand your position," I said. "Good. Now I need you to send an email to Dr. Williams explaining that you made an error in your analysis. Tell her that the code you flagged is actually part of an authorized testing protocol." He was asking me to lie to a federal official about a national security issue. If I sent that email, I'd be complicit in covering up the backdoors. But if I refused, he'd destroy my career and reputation. "I need some time to think about this," I said. "You have until noon. Send the email, or clean out your desk." I walked back to my cubicle and sat down. My colleagues were absorbed in their work, unaware that their supervisor was using their security clearances to cover up deliberate sabotage. I wondered how many of them knew what Greg was really doing. I wondered if any of them would have made the same choice I'd made. At 11:30 a.m., I opened my email client and started typing. But instead of the retraction Greg had demanded, I composed a second message to Dr. Williams. This one contained additional documentation I'd gathered overnight, including traffic logs showing exactly when the backdoors had transmitted data and to which offshore servers. I attached a note explaining that my supervisor had attempted to coerce me into sending a false retraction. I included screenshots of the fabricated performance evaluation he'd shown me. I sent the email at 11:58 a.m. At noon, Greg appeared at my desk with a security guard and someone from HR. "Mr. Barrett, you're being terminated for insubordination and failure to follow company protocols," the HR representative announced loud enough for everyone in the office to hear. "Please gather your personal belongings and surrender your badge and access cards." The security guard watched while I packed my few personal items into a cardboard box. My colleagues stared as I was escorted through the office and out to the parking lot. 6 years of work reduced to a walk of shame. But as I drove away from Aegis Secure Tech for the last time, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. That afternoon, I sat in my apartment and waited for the other shoe to drop. I'd burned every bridge at Aegis Secure Tech and probably destroyed my career in government contracting, but I'd also exposed a serious security breach that could have compromised national defense systems for years. My phone rang at 4 p.m. The caller identification showed a number I didn't recognize. "Mr. Barrett, this is Dr. Williams from DHS. I received your communications. Can you meet me this evening?" We arranged to meet at a coffee shop in downtown Arlington. Dr. Williams was a woman in her 50s with graying hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She'd brought a colleague, a man who introduced himself only as Agent Torres from the FBI. "Before we begin," Dr. Williams said, I want you to know that you're not in any legal trouble. What you've provided is exactly the kind of information we need to protect critical infrastructure. Agent Torres opened a laptop and showed me a series of screenshots. We've been investigating suspicious activity on several government networks for the past 6 months. The documentation you provided has helped us connect patterns that we couldn't explain before. The screenshots showed network traffic analysis from multiple federal agencies. Data was being extracted at regular intervals and routed through the same offshore servers I'd identified in Greg's Backdoors. How extensive is this? I asked. Based on your documentation, we believe Mr. Lathrop has compromised at least 12 different government systems, Dr. Williams said. The Treasury Department, Department of Homeland Security, and several defense contractors. The financial damage could be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. The national security implications are much worse. Agent Torres leaned forward. We need to know everything about how Aegis SecureTech operates, approval processes, client relationships, personnel with access to classified systems. Can you help us understand the full scope of the company's activities? I spent the next 3 hours walking them through everything I knew about Aegis SecureTech's operations, the security protocols, the client contracts, the personnel with access to sensitive systems. I explained how Greg's position gave him authority to approve code changes without oversight, and how that authority had been systematically abused. Is anyone else at the company involved? Agent Torres asked. I don't know, I said honestly. Greg was careful to compartmentalize information. Most of the technical staff probably have no idea what he was doing. Dr. Williams made notes on a legal pad. What made you suspect that something was wrong? The backdoors were too sophisticated to be accidents, I said. And when I confronted Greg about them, he didn't deny what he was doing. He just tried to justify it as good business practice. How long do you think this has been going on? Based on the timestamps in the code, at least 18 months, possibly longer. Agent Torres closed his laptop. Mr. Barrett, we're going to need you to provide a formal statement for our investigation. Are you willing to testify about what you've discovered? I thought about Greg's threat to destroy my security clearance, about the fabricated performance evaluation, about the humiliation of being fired in front of my colleagues. Yes, I said. Dr. Williams handed me a business card. Don't discuss this investigation with anyone except the contacts on this card. We'll be in touch within the next few days. As I drove home, I realized that my career in cybersecurity wasn't over. It was just beginning in a very different way. Instead of working for contractors who might compromise national security for profit, I'd be working directly with the people whose job was to protect it. For the first time in months, I felt like I was on the right side of something important. The next morning, I woke up to news reports about a federal investigation into cybersecurity breaches at government contractors. Aegis SecureTech wasn't mentioned by name, but the details matched what I'd reported to Dr. Williams. The story quoted an unnamed DHS official saying that the investigation involved systematic compromises of classified systems by personnel with authorized access. My phone rang while I was reading the article. It was Dr. Williams. Can you come in today? We have some developments you should know about. The DHS building in downtown Washington was nothing like the sterile office where I'd worked for Aegis SecureTech. Armed guards, metal detectors, and identification checks at every checkpoint. Dr. Williams met me in the lobby and escorted me through a maze of corridors to a secure conference room. Agent Torres was waiting with 2 other people, a woman from the Department of Justice and a man who introduced himself as Director Morrison from the FBI's Cyber Division. Mr. Barrett, Director Morrison began, based on your information, we executed search warrants at Aegis SecureTech early this morning. We've seized servers, workstations, and documentation. We've also frozen the company's government contracts and revoked security clearances for key personnel. The Justice Department attorney opened a folder. Greg Lathrop has been arrested on charges of espionage, computer fraud, and theft of government property. We've also arrested 2 other individuals, a systems administrator named Patricia Quinn and a project manager named David Walsh. I'd worked with both Patricia and David. They'd seemed like dedicated professionals who cared about cybersecurity. Learning that they'd been part of Greg's operation was like discovering that people I'd trusted had been lying to me for years. What about the other employees? I asked. Most of them appear to have been unaware of the criminal activity, Agent Torres said. They'll be interviewed as part of the investigation, but we don't expect charges against the majority of the technical staff. Director Morrison leaned forward. Mr. Barrett, we have a proposition for you. The government needs cybersecurity professionals who can identify and counter the kind of threats you've helped us uncover. We'd like to offer you a position as a classified systems architect with the Department of Homeland Security. I stared at him. Less than 24 hours ago, I'd been unemployed and potentially unemployable. Now I was being offered a position with the federal agency I'd been trying to protect. What would that involve? I asked. Dr. Williams answered. You'd work directly with our cybersecurity teams to identify vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure. You'd have clearance to access classified systems across multiple agencies. And you'd help us develop protocols to prevent the kind of breaches that Greg Lathrop was facilitating. The position comes with a significant increase in responsibility and compensation, Director Morrison added. It also comes with federal protection. The people Greg was working with may not be happy that their operation has been exposed. I thought about the 6 years I'd spent at Aegis Secure Tech, believing I was protecting national security while unknowingly helping to undermine it. This was a chance to do the work I'd always thought I was doing. I'm interested, I said. The Justice Department attorney slid a contract across the table. There are extensive background checks and security protocols involved. The clearance process will take several weeks. But if you're willing to start immediately, we can begin with preliminary assignments while the paperwork is processed. I signed the contract without reading all the details. Sometimes the right decision didn't require analysis. It just required courage. As I left the DHS building that afternoon, I realized that reporting Greg hadn't destroyed my career. It had given me the opportunity to build a better one. 6 weeks later, I sat in a federal courtroom as Greg Lathrop was sentenced to 15 years in prison for espionage and computer fraud. He'd tried to negotiate a plea deal by providing information about his foreign contacts, but the damage to national security had been too extensive for leniency. The judge read the charges methodically. Unauthorized access to classified systems, theft of government property, conspiracy to commit espionage. Each count carried its own prison term, and they would be served consecutively rather than concurrently. Greg's defense attorney had argued that he'd been recruited by foreign intelligence services and was more victim than perpetrator. The prosecution had countered with evidence showing that he'd been paid over $2 million for the classified information he'd stolen. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours. When the judge announced the sentence, Greg's shoulders sagged. He turned to scan the courtroom and saw me sitting in the gallery. For a moment, our eyes met. I'd expected to feel satisfaction or vindication. Instead, I felt only sadness for the waste of what could have been a distinguished career. Patricia Quinn and David Walsh had received lighter sentences in exchange for their cooperation with the investigation. They'd provided information that helped the FBI identify and arrest 3 foreign intelligence operatives who'd been receiving the stolen data. Dr. Williams was sitting beside me in the courtroom. As the bailiff led Greg away in handcuffs, she leaned over and whispered, "The backdoors he installed have been completely removed from all affected systems. It took our teams 3 weeks, but we've verified that the networks are secure." Outside the courthouse, Agent Torres approached me with an update on the investigation. "We've traced the stolen data to intelligence services in 2 different countries. The State Department is handling diplomatic responses, but I can tell you that some very important people are not happy about this breach." I thought about all the classified information that had been compromised during the 18 months that Greg's operation had been active. Military contractors, federal agencies, critical infrastructure systems. The full extent of the damage might never be known, but at least it had been stopped. 3 months into my new position at DHS, I was working on security protocols for power grid monitoring systems when Dr. Williams stopped by my office. "How are you settling in?" she asked. "It's different," I said, "but good different." My new job involved exactly the kind of work I'd thought I'd been doing at Aegis Secure Tech, identifying vulnerabilities, developing patches, and ensuring that critical systems remained secure. The difference was that now I knew my work was actually protecting national security rather than undermining it. I'd been assigned to a small team of cybersecurity specialists who worked directly with federal agencies to assess and improve their digital defenses. The clearance level was higher than anything I'd held before, and the responsibility was proportionally greater. "Any regrets about leaving the private sector?" Dr. Williams asked. I considered the question. At Aegis SecureTech, I'd been well paid and respected by my colleagues. I'd had job security and the possibility of advancement within a growing company. But I'd also been unknowingly complicit in activities that threatened national security. "No regrets," I said. That evening, I drove out to my father's farm in rural Virginia. He was working in his garden when I arrived, pulling weeds from between rows of tomato plants. I'd called him the day after Greg's sentencing to tell him about the trial and my new position. "Proud of you," he'd said simply. We sat on his porch as the sun set over the Blue Ridge Mountains. He didn't ask about classified details of my work, and I didn't offer them. But he understood that I'd made a choice that prioritized integrity over convenience. "Sometimes doing the right thing costs you everything," he said as we watched fireflies begin to blink in the gathering darkness. "Sometimes it gives you everything," I replied.